The narrative that follows deals with a rug, sometimes referred to as the Armenian Orphan Rug, sometimes referred to as the Coolidge rug. This was on display recently in Washington, D.C., in the Visitor Center of the White House. Although we were in Maryland the week before, we did not know about this and hence were unable to make plans to stay over and see the rug. This is a pity because we know a fair amount about the rug and would have really enjoyed seeing it. Armenians, like so many immigrant groups, nowadays referred to sometimes as minorities, have enhanced the diversity of America. They have added substantially to our culture. The diversity of our background and thinking has led to such things as diversity in literature, food, music, and the like. What follows is something that everyone in America should know about American history. Yet it's a great pity that so little is in fact taught about this aspect of American involvement in helping others. In fact, the Armenian genocide, or the Turkish genocide against the Armenians, that is to say the attempt to annihilate them under cover of World War I, elicited a response in America initiated through the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau, started a relief effort that is basically the beginnings of American philanthropy abroad. The many aspects of foreign aid, many aspects of relief in times of tragedy and need, many attempts were made by individuals, small groups on a relatively small but effective level, sometimes not so effective, are part of American history. But the foundation called the Near East Relief, nowadays under the auspices of a new name, Near East Foundation, still doing tremendously important work, is the very foundation of American charity. Some have even said that the Peace Corps owes its origin to some of the mentality behind the Near East Relief. So when people talk about doing good from the perspective of the American people, not the American government necessarily, because in fact the Near East Relief was essentially a private foundation, we should know more about it. It's what we're all about. I've heard from many individuals who were growing up as children, were admonished by their parents, clean up your plate, remember the starving Armenians. Well, they themselves as children had in fact heard about the Armenians that were starving in the Near East under the general title of Bible lands. And they were encouraged to contribute pennies, nickels, whatever, to the cause to save youngsters their own age. That's all part of our history, but we've forgotten a lot of it. Now, there's a couple of things that we're going to look at quickly that are very effective. One of the cartoonists of the period, when a fella needs a friend. We can see here a close-up of this very effective little cartoon, as it were, Armenia and Syria. And this other one, which is a little bit more colorful. But during that period, the United States and others, to a lesser extent, did a great deal to show that they cared and wanted to help. The various committees that had come together to try to raise relief funds for the survivors of what we now call the genocide ultimately came together under a larger organization called the American Committee for Relief in the Near East. This evolved eventually into the Near East Relief, and even today, as we mentioned, it's the Near East Foundation. Many orphanages were set up with quite a lot of difficulty. It looks on the map as though there are many of them, and there are, but one should not lose sight of the fact that they were rather small houses with house mothers, sometimes 12, 14 kids. There were about 5,000, for instance, in the Harput area. Now, the idea was to have the orphans be initially, or at least thereafter, as self-sustaining as possible. They were taught trades, participated in crafts, and were taught to be able to survive on their own. The orphanages could not accommodate all the needy. Now, the story of the Near East Relief was written in 1930 by a Protestant Congregationalist minister. Actually, he had Quaker origins in the state of Vermont. And it's called Story of the Near East Relief by James Levi Barton. Calls it an interpretation. One of the aspects of this excellent book that we have noticed more than once is that it's a bit weak necessarily on the very personal aspects. In other words, the face of the organization is given, but less attention is given to the face of the people that it sought to help. And of course, that's very understandable, because the book would be 10 times as large if it did that. So we've always felt that there's a lot out there, and we've even conducted what we referred to kind of semi-jokingly as graveside interviews, seeking to gain a better perspective on some of these people. One thing that one can say about Dr. Barton's book, and that's for certain, is that it was very important, and it told a story about American involvement. There were a few foreigners who played crucial roles that were mentioned as well, but we're concentrating on the Americans here. A notice of the book that was published in the New York Times in early December 1930. It was a notice, it wasn't a book review. Started off with a very significant statement, we think. It read, "In a very real and intimate sense, this book belongs to almost the whole of the people of the United States, since almost every man, woman, and child in the country contributed to the work of the Near East Relief, the story of whose labors and achievements it tells." End quote. This theme shouldn't be forgotten as we progress through our narration and commentary on the Armenian Orphan Rug. It is an American story, not just a story of interest to people who have Armenian connections or Armenian roots. Now, the Orphan Rug that we've highlighted in the title, I first came across it in the Near East Relief, written by Dr. Barton. It's very small, not a terribly effective picture, and there's a comment or two made about it by Barton. The rug, I've seen pictures of it. We've got them, as it were. Here's one where it's a clip essentially from a much larger picture about which we'll say a bit more. But the thing that is weak, and I'm not saying this from the critical viewpoint, but more from the feeling that we have that we owe a little bit more for greater detail on this, is who were the orphans that actually made this rug? Maybe not the exact names of each and every one, no matter how attractive and excellent that would be to know. But the orphan rug, where did it come from? Why was there a need to make this rug in the first place? Apparently, President Coolidge was very fond of this rug, so much so that when he left the White House, the story goes that he took it with him. Well, the orphan rug came about as a result of a great tragedy in the history of the Armenian people. During the cover of World War I, the Armenians were, as I put it irreverently, done in, or attempts were made to annihilate them and deport them. We usually think of genocide occurring in what can be called the Nazi genocide or Jewish Holocaust perspective. But one need not look at it that way for all genocides. The genocide process in the Ottoman Empire against the Armenians and the Assyrians and the Greeks comprised direct murder, but also by deportation. The deportation was a euphemism for extermination by yet another means. Murder, privations, disease, no food, no water, all of the hardships of moving people out en masse without provisions deliberately. In some cases, people were given a few hours' notice, leave your home. This is documented by Americans who were on the scene. One that's become a bit of a classic is the so-called Slaughterhouse Province by American consul to Harput, Eastern Turkey, an area which is an epicenter in old Armenia. Consul Davis was a lawyer, and he actually witnessed the unfolding of the Armenian genocide and even photographed piles of dead bodies. We need not go into the gruesome aspects because even the less gruesome aspects are pretty horrendous. Bodies lined up, people who died by the roadside, skeletons thrown in ravines, skulls. All of these kinds of things are richly documented photographically. We need not be preoccupied with that. Now, another aspect that has been of interest to us, because there's a very substantial paper and photographic trail on this, is that when the war was over and Turkey had capitulated, the remnants of the Armenians and the Syrians, other Christians, were in great need of help somehow or other. People had survived, they had hidden, they'd bought their way out, they had been taken in by Muslims who had some conscience, others took them in as wives, others took them in as slaves virtually. The motives were substantial and varied, but there was a tattered remnant. And when the Americans went over it, the first ones went over really en masse, leaving early 1919 under the auspices of the then American Committee for Relief in the Near East, went over on the huge one-time German ship Vaterland, which was renamed the Leviathan, ended up getting centers of distribution set up. And here we see a picture of some of the relief workers on their way to Harput, Harpert in Armenia. Harpert pronunciation sometimes come out as Harput or Harput. They went, and what did they find? As I said, a tattered remnant of a few survivors. These pictures that follow give an idea of what they encountered. Taking them in, trying to clean them up, setting up orphanages. They couldn't take in all of them. The facilities weren't large enough. An aspect that's not talked about much, although it's been spoken of a bit more recently, is that many of the Armenian girls who had been forcibly taken into Turkish households, married off, not married off, whatever, ended up having children. And one of the relief workers, a very excellent nurse, highly regarded by her colleagues, named Florence Stively from Syracuse, did her best to try to get the young Armenian mothers to accept their children fully. There was a psychological problem here in that these half-Turk, half-Armenian children were a bit of a stigma. In this photograph here, taken by Mrs. McDaniels, who was one of the relief workers, says, young hopefuls, half-Turk, half-Armenian, zero loved, no clean milk, Miss Dively, their determined savior. What the fate of these kids and women were is something that ends up being a problem. It haunts many who actually think about the details. Now, we've seen from that map with the red marks, and I've emphasized that some of the orphanages were rather small. A few others were huge. And this image here in the Caucasus indicates the many thousands of orphans that were looked after by the Near East Relief. Again, the question is, where did all these orphans come from? I think it's evident. Now, the story of the many who served in the Near East Relief, whose names are given largely in an appendix in Dr. Barton's book, is quite substantial. These people did a terrific job. They were real heroes. And in keeping with giving heroes medals, the Near East Relief did just that. Here's an image of a medal that was cast for such a purpose. We see the front and we see the back. There are others, however, who did terrific service, whose stories certainly deserve being told, but they didn't get medals. Emma Cushman, seen in this unusual picture with some Armenian orphans, was one such person. She devoted her life giving service to orphans and even ended up going to Greece to look after the orphans there after all of the kids were ejected out of Asia Minor. The next image is the cover of a book that shows a fellow much beloved whose nickname came to be Papa Kunstler. Kunstler was trained as a nurse pharmacist who served in the early period preceding the Armenian genocide and had had a considerable amount of experience. We see him in this image, which a youngster, unidentified by us. A book was written in English about his work, his service, and it's well worth reading. It's a beautiful book. His many writings, not a huge number, but they are still substantial and numerous, are, being a Swiss, written in German. One has been reissued. Very excellent book. And you note at the top of that an image that is familiar to some people about orphans. To pick up the thread, one has to pay a little bit of attention to the following. The map is very detailed, and of course we can't spend time on it. But this deals with the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, the divvying up, if you will. It was done according to the Treaty of Sèvres. Well, the Turks did not appreciate the terms of the treaty, refused to accept it. And when I say the Turks, I mean those Turks who were ultra-nationalists under the leadership of Kemal Ataturk. The father of the Turks is the name that he was later given or adopted. But the idea was that more than ever, the slogan, "Turkey for the Turks," came into being. It seemed very appropriate, in fact necessary, for the Near East relief to bring about the evacuation of the orphans from the orphanages and facilities, feeding centers, what have you, out of Turkey proper. What the Turks now call Anatolia, which were really Asia Minor. Historically, the western part, the western coast of the Turkish peninsula, was what the Greeks called Anatolia, the East, land of the rising sun. But in any case, the story of moving these orphans out is yet another important part that has been inadequately documented. The story is certainly there, it's known about, but not exhaustively studied by any means. The two next maps from one of Papa Kunstler's writings shows the routes taken out of some parts of Eastern Asia Minor, where the orphanages were set up by Near East Relief, into the more southern areas. And of course, there's a lot of imagery associated with this, where you see trains of orphans, sometimes mistaken as refugees. Well, they weren't refugees. These kids were removed under difficult circumstances by volunteers, many of them heroes. One actually lost his life in the process. Getting these kids out to safety. Now, one of the areas to which the orphans were moved was in what then was referred to as Greater Syria. It's now Lebanon. Are a couple of orphanages about which much can be said, but we can't do that here. But one of them in the enlargement shows you that Jubel and Ghazir, one area, is where the actual carpet, the Coolidge rug, the Armenian Orphan Rug, was produced. Now, again, much can be said about the history of how this rug came into prominence. One is due to a very fine Armenian dentist, now an ultra senior citizen in his 90s, took a great deal of interest in Armenian rugs in general, and in the orphan rug in particular. Dr. Duranian's book on the Armenian Orphan Rug is an excellent work, and on the cover we see a picture of President Coolidge being presented the rug by Dr. Finley from the Near East Relief. The back cover shows an image of the rug. Now, one of the things that interested us is that, never having seen the carpet, we never were really sure of the coloration. The pictures and photographs weren't all that terrific. So that was one thing that we missed out on. We still don't really know how perfect the imagery is on it. I think it's worthwhile saying a few things about Dr. Duranian and the book, because otherwise one wouldn't get a full appreciation of how the book came into being. First of all, Martin came from Worcester, Massachusetts. He still lives in a suburb of Worcester. Worcester, my own hometown, is arguably the epicenter for Armenian immigration. It certainly was the main center for immigration after World War I. The picture that follows is one taken by the Armenian photographer, a very expert photographer incidentally, the late Chazaros Sarkis Melikian, who worked for many years in Worcester and essentially never retired. This picture is of the Sunday school classes from the 1935-1936 season, if you will. The Armenian kids, the slightly older kids, the children, are all, for the most part, descendants of survivors of the genocide. And when I say for the most part, there were a very few whose parents had come over after the Hamidian massacres in the 1890s. Or some of them had one parent who was a survivor, the other parent having been in America while the genocide was happening. Dr. Duranian's father, Martiros Duranian, was the principal of the Armenian Sunday School. His picture shows him next to Reverend Hagop Mikjan, who was the dead hide or priest, a very fine man. And Martin grew up apparently having a very real interest in Armenian history. Martin had had a long time interest in rugs, was one of the founding members of the Armenian Rug Society. He had a relative, I've forgotten exactly who, but Mr. Bogigian was related, I think, to his mother and was one of the very early rug merchants in America. So the story apparently thickens. He tracks down the rug, and by 1982 was able to make a presentation to the meeting of the Armenian Rug Society, a very short abstract. But by 1984, a longer, more substantial article was posted on his behalf by the senator from Michigan, Carl Levin. And here it is in the Congressional Record. The Congressional Record is online now, but as it turns out, the 1984 is an issue that predates it being posted electronically. So if you want to read it, you're going to either have to go to a library and dig it up or get it by some other means. But there are some Armenians who've written terrifically excellent books. One is called The Inscribed Armenian Rugs of Yesteryear. And the fun thing about this book is that it is one of the places where one can read at least a bit about the Coolidge or Armenian Orphan Rug. Now, I took the trouble to contact a fellow, a real gentleman, who's dead now. He died of cancer, unfortunately, who undertook the responsibility of cleaning the Coolidge rug prior to its being deposited in the White House. Misak Kalechian of Beirut, now California, who was interested in orphans and orphanages in Lebanon, contacted me and asked whether a good photograph of the orphan rug could be located. He ultimately wrote a couple of articles in Armenian for Zartong and Aztag. This was back in 2005 and 2006. I asked the Vermont Historical Society if they could locate a picture, and in fact they were able to, and they pointed out that the two photographs that they supplied were in fact initially taken by the photo people, Underwood and Underwood. So these very fine pictures, so far as I know, are the only ones dealing with the so-called acceptance of the rug. Dr. Finley is shown in them. I haven't taken the trouble to figure out who all the other officials are, but one day someone might do that. The interesting sort of peripheral stuff that came out of the early investigations that could not have occurred without Dr. Turanian's help and Mr. Kashishian's help is that he brought to my attention something that I hadn't really thought about very much. And that is that cultural genocide was then beginning to come into the fore and be thought of as an aspect of genocide that was significant. A book on architectural genocide was included in this whole concept, and I thought that was interesting. But the more interesting aspects from the more immediate perspective is that an estimate evaluation was made of the carpet from a professional rug person's perspective. And we can see these here in detail. The number of knots, the kind of rug, namely an Isfahan rug, the quality, the dollar amount was conservatively estimated then at $18,500, and of course he immediately pointed out that it was a priceless rug, which it is, and most will agree that it has tremendous significance. The next step, so far as I'm concerned, is that Mr. Stepan Karadian, Steve Karadian, as it were, from Michigan, now deceased, unfortunately, a really interesting guy who I never met, but spoke to on the telephone many times. And the point that came out there, the mother and the sister were taught how to weave rugs. His mother, of course, came to America and married. Her sister stayed in France, and I believe, if I remember right, that they were in Marseille, like so many Armenians. Steve's wife, Anahid, or Anne, will probably know that detail. He was an avid ham radio fellow, and he knew a huge amount about Armenian stamps and pins and the like, and a very, very avid interest in the Near East Relief Foundation. There was a brief article about him on his collecting and his perspective. I really don't know. He had plans to give the Near East Foundation his material. I don't know if that's happened yet. This is a period photograph of Khazir town. Neither of us has been to Lebanon, so we can't say how the town has developed nowadays. It's probably a fairly large place, but this gives an idea of what it was then like. Now, we're going to take a kind of a speedy trip through the following pictures to give you an idea of what the orphanage was like and who the inmates were, so to speak, the kids that were looked after, that had been admitted, had grown up, some of them even married there. And then we're going to pay a bit of attention on the rug weaving activities that led to the Khazir or Coolidge or orphan rug being woven for the White House. This picture shows Papa Kunstler and his wife, who was a nurse. She was apparently a lovely person, just as he was. You can see her here with these adorable orphans. Some of them are moved a little bit, so the picture isn't perfect, but one certainly can appreciate these wonderful kids being looked after. The next picture is Mama with 5 orphans, one of whom seems to have gotten ill because there's like a band-aid or bandage around her head. A meal scene in the orphanage, followed by a view of some slightly older girls, a classroom scene, a group of the orphan inmates, a view of some of the older girls that had been collected, as it were, from various homes, usually Muslims, in the areas of deportation. The idea was to rehabilitate them and take them into the orphanage and care for them. This was done after the war was over, of course, and the Muslim element was advised, mainly by the British and others, to release all Christian girls that had been taken into non-Christian homes. The orphanage scene in the next picture shows that there were more than a few of these people. And as we mentioned earlier, the idea was to make the orphans self-supporting to the extent possible. The view here is of the sales room, where rugs that had been woven by the girls had been piled up. They would go to the Beirut market, and from Beirut they would be distributed usually. The next view is of slightly older girls, and the next one even shows how some of the orphans grew up and were married. Now, the weaving of a sophisticated rug, like the Coolidge rug, was not done by little kids. Usually when we think of an orphan, we think of someone poor and young, and maybe even a child that's kind of knee-high. But these were done by girls that were mature and experienced. They had been taught. They must have had a lot of innate talent and ability. Some of the rugs were enormous. And you can see the tag of one of them that says Near East Relief. And one would fill in all of the details of the specifics. Now, the Coolidge rug was not the only large rug woven. We see in this scene here that there's a couple of pretty large rugs. And Papa Kunstler was a fundraiser. They say he was a very diligent, well-liked man. Here he is with his briefcase. There's a family story, apparently, that he was kept aside at the Ellis Island facility, accusing him of being a fundraiser that was going to be a bit of a pest. Well, he was an avid and persistent fundraiser, and without this activity, the funds simply would not have been forthcoming. One of the strategies used by the Near East Relief was the idea of talking about a golden rule. Now, the golden rule, as we all know, is you do unto others as you would have done unto you. And this little yellow ruler of paper shows the mentality was that if you were able to use such and such a length, you'd be supporting such and such a number of people. And the next scene showing three sides is that one's taken the top part and the back and then an enlargement. Now, having said what I've just said about the golden rule and shown the paper or very light cardboard ruler that was distributed to those who might give or those who had given, it's interesting to note Mr. Kashishian made a sketch of the back fabric on the corner of the Coolidge rug that brings to the fore the concept of the golden rule. Apparently a photograph was taken of this, but we've never seen it. But it was of interest that in some of the photographs of the rug on display, they had that edge turned back so that it could be read. And of course, it's also inscribed at that point on a fabric tag, as it were, similar to the ones that we've shown. Normally, one thinks of rug weaving, or at least I think normally for the average person, rug weaving is done on relatively small looms. For those of us who have never woven a rug or even really repaired one, we can't say much about it. Here is a fun sketch that shows one of the loom setups with young weavers. And it's apparently, it's clearly annotated in German handwriting, presumably Papa Kunstler's, that talks about the rug, and he points out that $2 million were provided through, he uses the German word durch, Coolidge, and that requires some thinking too, in that certainly it wasn't donated directly by Coolidge, but presumably under Coolidge's period of office holding. But the $2 million was an important part of the Gazier orphanage's income. It was only with this kind of money that they could do what they wanted to do. You've seen the small sketch then, but now you have to consider how was a huge rug like the Armenian Orphan Rug or the Gazier rug or the Coolidge rug woven. This is apparently a photograph, an actual photograph of the Gazier loom setup. It's quite substantial, you will agree. Idea of a rug as a gift to the American people via the White House, to adorn the White House, the center of American activity and power and beneficence, etc., in the eyes of the donors, was not the only reason for making the rug. Yes, orphans were looked after, younger, slightly older, more mature. But one of the benefits that came out of the funds was the realization of a dream on the part of the Kunstlers to build housing for older women and widows who had survived the horrors of the genocide. And these pictures show some of those women and the housing that had been assembled and put up for them. The Kunstlers, of course, were very fluent in Armenian, and we see Mama Kunstler talking to some older ones. There's a book in Armenian that deals with the good work and beneficence of the Kunstlers and their hard work on behalf of the Armenians. One additional bit of information that's come out of our studies involves the photographs, very few photographs in fact, that we've encountered here and there and everywhere of the orphan carpets as taken before the presentation was made in America. That is to say, pictures that were taken in what's now Lebanon. One photograph that you'll see shows the Gazier carpet, or the Coolidge rug, on the right-hand side. Another photograph is seen where the rug is on the left-hand side. Now, because we're interested in photographs in great detail, we ask ourselves, which one is the correct posture? Well, as it turns out, Papa Kunstler has made a note, you can see that here, that the White House rug is the one on the right-hand side. So the one that we showed first is in fact the correct one. Minor detail, but might as well get it right if one can. So we're grateful to have that tiny piece of information. Now the carpets all show the weavers on the top, and of course they come out small because the rugs are big. We've attempted to scan images at high resolution, 1200 dpi. The blow-up shown here of a couple of young women and Papa Kunstler were not helpful in identifying Steve Krikorian's mother or aunt. It seemed that neither of them fit the bill. But it's worth the effort to try to do these kinds of things. In fact, you saw way back when we showed what I call the Sunday school picture. We embarked on a project where we put numbers adjacent to the young people, and we did a circulation of the photograph amongst all of the older people in Worcester, including some of my older siblings. and we came up with a pretty good identification roster. These little kinds of projects are important because it's a way of remembering. And once it's lost, it's lost. As Dr. Duranian has pointed out to me on more than one occasion, if we don't do it, who will? I want to mention a thing or two about John Finley, who was one of the people that made the presentation to President Coolidge. As I said, we hadn't taken the trouble to find out who the others were. I'm sure that won't be a big deal. However, it was particularly appropriate for Finley because he had been to Armenia. He had had a very real experience in Armenia with orphans. Here's a picture from the New York State Library. He was an educator. He played a major role in New York State education. He was actually, for a while, one of the editors of the New York Times. While Finley was in Armenia, he was able to visit. In fact, that was part of the purpose of the visit, was to evaluate what was happening at the various orphanages. The very large orphanage at Alexandropol. We've seen one picture of one of the huge orphanages, but here's yet another. These were advertised, if you will, as the largest orphanages in the world. And again, the question comes up, and we know the answer. Where did all these orphans come from? No one that we know wants the orphan rug, the Armenian orphan rug, to become political football. These kinds of things do happen, and we don't have time nor the inclination to examine this in any detail. But the cartoon, if you will, that is in the next frame, shows that in the latter part of the 1800s and early 1900s, some of the French political satire magazines ran fake advertisements for the sale of rugs from Armenia, from the massacre sites in Armenia. This was done to ridicule political leaders in France and elsewhere who refused to do anything to stop the massacres. They could have really done something, and they didn't. They were all very anxious not to see the Ottoman Empire broken up. They had their own selfish reasons, but they definitely participated very diligently in propping up the so-called sick man of Europe. Abdul Hamid II instigated many massacres of the Armenians. These, of course, are called the Hamidian massacres. This was a means, as far as his mentality was concerned, I believe, one of what you call administering the empire through massacre. It was one way of keeping people in their place. We don't want that to happen with the Gazir rug, and some would say, well, how is that going to happen? Well, the fact of the matter is that we see the very short, brief display of the orphan rug at the White House in some measure, maybe we're being unfair, but I don't think so, a denial not only of the Armenian genocide for reasons of political expediency. We don't want to apparently insult Turkishness, and I'm using a phrase that comes apparently from Turkish law. You can actually be prosecuted for insulting Turkishness. But by refusing to acknowledge facts, part of American history, directly, and in a forthright manner, some can say that by extension, this is a denial of the history, the culture, the very existence of the Armenians. And this is all the more ridiculous because it was the Americans, young and old, who played a major role in seeing that the Armenian survivors, the remnants of the Turkish genocide against the Armenians to actually exist. So here we are not only denying that aspect of the history, we're denying our own American history. Now, we're going to continue with a little afterword, which we hope you'll take the trouble to read, because it will end up, we hope, bringing together the history of the rug, the history of the entire effort of the Near East relief. Also, because of our interest in photographs, we haven't taken too much trouble to say here precisely, for reasons of time and space, the origin of the photographs. They are all, as we say, attested and identified. They are real. We will also give a short listing of those many people who participated in making a lot of these pictures available to us. And we are very grateful to them for this tremendous help.